Okay. Well, last time I talked about achieving conceptual novelty with purely logical means. How can you use logic to generate genuinely new concepts from old ones? And I argued that or was motivated by the thought that the first thing to ask is, what do you mean by new? And looked at a hierarchy of different senses in which new concepts could be considered new relative to old ones, that the process of introducing them could be ampliative or creative in the sense that you get something out that you hadn't put in. And at the highest level, I used a triangular discussion of Frege, Kant, and Euclid to try and explain the sense of novelty that Frege diagnoses that I claim was already present in Euclid's elements, and that Kant saw that, and this was responsible for large features of Kant's view. I'm not going to go back into the Kant story, but let me remind you how this story ended up. It is that the creative aspect of what you can get from logic, conceptual novelty or ampliativity, comes from redescription, from reanalysis of a content. In particular, in Euclid, we see genuinely new things coming when we look at the role that some figure plays in construction now with respect to other figures as well. So we saw, in particular, in proving proposition 1 in Euclid's Elements, you start with 2 points considered as the endpoints of a line segment. You then consider them as the same 2 points. One is the center of a circle, and the other is determining the radius of the circle. And by the end, we're seeing that same line segment as the base of an equilateral triangle that's been constructed. And it's the fact that we can move back and forth between considering the line segment as a portion of a line, as the radius of a circle, and as the side of a triangle, moving back and forth between those. Each one of those contexts we can put it in by relating it to other things, to the circle and the triangle that we construct. Each one of those gives us a different kind of inferential grip on it, because it exhibits it as playing a role in a different inferential pattern. We know different things about lines, extending lines, parallelism of lines, than we know about circles. We know about circles that, for instance, all their radii are of the same length. We know various things about triangles. Their angles add up to 2 right angles. Each of those gives a different inferential context and invokes a different pattern of inference that we can use in thinking about that line segment. And my claim was that's exactly what Frege gives us a theory of. For him, the conceptual novelty comes when you take some expression and consider the different functional analyses that you can give of it. So in an expression like 2 to the 4th, we can think of that as applying the function raised to the 4th power to the argument 2. Raised to the 4th power, if we discern that function, we get one inferential pattern that goes with it. Raising to the 4th power, raising any argument x to the 4th power, is always identical to x times x times x times x, for instance. So we know we can exploit that sort of identity. But on the other hand, we can also think of it as applying the argument raised 2 to the power as applied to the argument 4 We know that raising 2 to any power y is going to be equivalent to 2 times 2 times 2 y times. That's a different inferential pattern for it. And if we consider both the 2 and the 4 as arguments for the raise the one thing to the other power function, then we get a different pattern, a different inferential pattern for it as well. In what I call the computational reading of senses, each one of those functional decompositions is a function applied to an argument, a theta, and the claim is those are modes of presentation of the values that they compute. In this case, they all compute the value 16. They're modes of presentation of that which is the Bedeutung of the expression 2 to the 4th, but they're different modes of presentation of it, different functions applied to arguments. And each one of those comes with its own inferential pattern. Frege's claim is that senses contain modes of presentation. Right, all of the functional decomposition of an expression are thetas, and that whole constellation of them is what I want to identify with the sense. And what we're seeing in the analogy between Frege's argument about functional decomposition getting us genuinely new concepts in the sense that the lines around the extensions are not just borrowed from the boundaries of the extensions of the concepts that we put together, the way they are for Boolean combinations, but you get genuinely new things. When we can, in particular, alternate quantifiers and say for all x there is a y, such that rxy, that's something you can't represent with a Venn or Euler or an Euler diagram. That's the new stuff that he's getting. And I ended with this comparison between the evident introduction of novelty in Euclid, where we start off just with the capacity to join 2 points with a line and to take the 2 points as defining a circle, and introduce the wholly new notion of triangles and prove that that there always is an equilateral triangle with any particular line segment as a base. Kant and sort of everyone was struck with the contrast between getting something new out of what you started with in Euclid and the sense in which you just don't with syllogism. That in the syllogism, the major premise already includes, always already includes the conclusion that you get from it. So that's just a quick recap from last time. In connection with reading these late fragments on logic, I want to continue to drill down on the Sinn-Bedeutung distinction between sense and, I'll just leave Bedeutung untranslated as we have before. For today, I want to focus entirely at the level of sentences. The Bedeutung of a sentence, he says, is a truth value. The Sinn, the sense of a sentence, is a thought. We're going to hear more about the thoughts next time. I want to start with this, with the level of Bedeutung, though we'll come round to have some more things to say about Sinn at the end. One reason to focus on this claim that sentences must have Bedeutungen and they must be truth values, one reason to focus on that is one diagnosis for what goes wrong in the Grundgesetze that leads to the inconsistency that Bertrand Russell pointed out is Frege's move from logical concepts, which he can introduce in the ways he does in the Grundgesetze, to logical objects. And it's the move to logical objects through abstraction by introducing the notion of courses of values. That's where he oversteps in insisting that every function have an object associated with it that's the course of values. That's the source of the difficulty in one way or another. So many people have diagnosed the crucial misstep conceptually, as opposed to the technical issues that lead to the inconsistency, as being the introduction of logical objects, which for Frege are always courses of values. They're introduced by abstraction. Two functions have the same course of values, just in case they have the same values for the same arguments. And if you give that definition sort of wide open, introduce these courses of values, then you're going to get courses of values that correspond to the set of things that are not members of themselves that Russell points to. Now, before he introduces courses of values, though, he introduces truth values as logical objects. And it's important to him that he can. That's how he can introduce the notion of truth function to understand sentential logical connectives. It's worth looking more closely at that first step towards the notion of logical objects that is the introduction of truth values. I mentioned in connection with Bolzano that though in the 4 volumes of the Wissenschaftslehre, he does 4 times use the phrase truth value, he glosses it just as whether the sentence is true or false. By truth value, I mean whether it's true or false. So he doesn't have particular objects that are truth values. That really is an innovation of Frege's. Is that already a problem? Or how should we think about those first logical objects that he introduces? And here, so I just want to think about the notion of truth values. And initially, I think we can see that there's a basic discursive bipolarity that's marked by the terms true and false. Initially, naively thinking of them as properties sentences can have. They can be true or false. But that's the semantic version of this basic discursive bipolarity. Thinking in terms of truth or falsity in assessing the semantic status of sentences. There's a pragmatic version as well. The fundamental difference of doxastic attitudes between accepting a claimable and rejecting it. These are clearly intimately tied up because we can paraphrase accepting it. We can think of that as taking it to be true, rejecting it as taking it to be false. Those doxastic attitudes, doxastic of or pertaining to belief, those 2 doxastic attitudes get expressed linguistically in 2 different kinds of speech act, in assertion and denial. I'm not going to worry much about the relation between assertion and denial on the speech act side and the attitudes of acceptance and rejection that they are the overt expression of. I'm going to think of both of those as pragmatic sides of this fundamental bipolarity. And Frege himself, in the passages that we, that I put excerpts from on the website, he says, bottom of the first page of those, what in the first place distinguishes it, truth, from all other predicates is that predicating it is always including and predicating anything whatever. Therefore, it's really by using the form of an assertoric sentence that we assert truth, and for this we do not need the word true. Indeed, we can say that even where we use the form of the expression, it is true that, the essential thing is really the assertoric form of the sentence. And again later, this is at the bottom of page 4 in those passages. In fact, at bottom, the sentence, it is true that 2 is prime, says no more than the sentence 2 is prime. If in the first case we express a judgment, this is not because of the word true, but because of the assertoric force we give the word is. So Frege is also seeing a parallel between what I'm calling the pragmatic version of this basic discursive bipolarity, accept, reject, assert, deny, and saying, well, though truth is indefinable, 2/3 of the way down page 1, he says, truth is obviously something so primitive and simple, it's not possible to reduce it to anything still simpler. Nonetheless, he thinks we get our grip on it from the pragmatics, from what we're doing in asserting, from the assertional force, that's his Kraft, that's his term for the pragmatic side of things. I mean, downstream from this, I think it's fair to say the Anglophone tradition has wanted to understand the doxastic attitudes in terms of the semantic version of the bipolarity, to think, well, truth is the fundamental thing, and taking true, that's sort of acknowledging the semantic contentfulness. Rejecting, that's really taking to be false. I think that's the usual order or commoner order of explanation of people who want to treat one of these dimensions, pragmatic or semantic, as more basic. A pragmatist order of direction of explanation, though, goes the other way around and says, look, really, what Frege mentions here is just what you should say. The only grip you're going to get on the notion of truth is that that's what you're taking some sentence to have when you accept it, when you believe it, when you're prepared to assert it. At any rate, there's room for these different orders of explanation that one could have. A claim Ulf and I make in our recent Philosophy of Logic book is that you aren't going to really understand that basic discursive bipolarity if you stay at the level of sentences. That you've got to look to reason relations among the sentences. Reason relations is our term, generic term for relations of implication or consequence on the one side and incompatibility on the other side. Call them reason relations because implication is the relation among sentences that's appealed to when you give a reason for a claim. A reason for a claim is, at least at base and to begin with, asserting a premise from which it follows, a premise that implies it, that has it as a consequence. And incompatibility is the relation among sentences that you invoke when you're giving a reason against something. You give a reason against by asserting something incompatible with it. And this is all meant to be conceptually more basic than the specifically logical notions of logical entailment and inconsistency. we'll see that there's connections, but even if you've never heard of logic, you can make sense of these reason relations. And our claim is that the distinction between implication or consequence and incompatibility is both more basic than, and in an important sense lines up with, the distinction between truth and falsity via the notion of reasons for and reasons against. And here I want to mention two lines of argument, let's say. And one is that if you think at the level of reason relations, you can see a relation between the pragmatic and the semantic versions of the basic discursive bipolarity that you can't see otherwise. And here, if you look at the handout, middle of page 1, I have the global isomorphism. Wolf is the one who came up with this. The formulae I have here are for implication. There's a corresponding thing. It's sort of obvious how to change these to get a notion of incompatibility. The pragmatic theory we look at is bilateral. This is Greg Restall, Dave Ripley are the ones who've pushed this reading of implication to say that a set of premises gamma, a set of sentences, imply the conclusion A, pragmatically, is that anybody who accepts all of gamma is precluded thereby from entitlement to deny A. It's bilateral in that we think of what's on the left side of the implication turnstile as a matter of acceptance and what's on the right side as a matter of denial. And so if commitment to gamma precludes entitlement to reject, commitment to accept gamma precludes entitlement to reject A, in that sense, you're implicitly committed to accept A. That's not the same thing as accepting, explicitly accepting, but in a bivalent setting, those are your options for your attitudes. And this seems like a good way to understand the reason relation of implication as codifying the notion of being a reason for. That's a pragmatic sense of how you have to take or treat the sentences to be taking or treating the premises as giving you reasons for the conclusions. Now, I should say parenthetically, we want to keep separate sets of books on the reason relations and the actual giving and asking of reasons. As Harman points out, arguing iconoclastically that there is no such thing as deductive inference. He's saying, well, if there were, surely a paradigm of it would be the inference from P, and if P then Q to Q. But you shouldn't always make that inference. You might have much better reasons against Q than you have for P, and if P then Q. And then what you should do is give up one of them. Logic doesn't tell us what to believe. It just constrains our beliefs. It tells us don't believe P, if P then Q, and reject Q, or believe not Q. But it only puts a coherence constraint on our attitudes. And that coherence constraint is what's expressed by the relation of consequence or of incompatibility. So it's those reason relations which are invoked in giving reasons for, but there's room for slippage between them. And what Global points out is we can give an exactly analogous indeed ultimately isomorphic semantic definition of the reason relation of implication. It finds truth-maker semantics, which is a modal semantics. It's a semantics of states rather than possible worlds. And the states are divided into possible and impossible states. That's already moving beyond possible worlds, where in effect there's only one impossibility. And it's a mereological theory. It says states can be fused to form wholes that have them as parts. And though this is not any of the several definitions of implication that Kit and his students have considered, Ulf suggests, there's a perfectly respectable notion of implication in the truth-maker framework, that for premises gamma to imply a conclusion A is for every fusion of truth-makers of all the propositions in gamma with any falsity maker of A to always be an impossible state. So let me stop there for a second. Can you see the isomorphism between these? In the semantic case, we're looking at the impossibility of fusions of truth makers and false makers. In the pragmatic case, we're looking at the impossibility of being entitled to a set of commitments to accept corresponding to the truth makers, and commitments to reject corresponding to the falsity makers. This is at the level of reason relations rather than at the level of sentences, analogous to saying acceptance is taking true and rejection is taking false. But now we're looking sort of up a level at the reason relations. As I say, for incompatibility, we just say that gamma is incompatible with A if commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to accept A. And in the truth maker framework, we say gamma is incompatible with A if every fusion of truth makers of all of gamma with any truth maker of A is an impossible state. So we've sort of lifted the relation between the pragmatic and semantic versions of truth and falsity, acceptance and rejection. We've lifted that up to the level of reason relations. And what we see when we do is the possibility of an isomorphism, a way in which we can understand something that Fine does not address, which is the question, how do you have to use expressions in order thereby to be attributing to them the truth makers and false makers that the semantic theory understands them in terms of? And the answer we're offering him is you have to use them according to a bilateral understanding of those sentences, which is entirely a matter of attitudes of accepting and rejecting, and the deontic normative notions of commitment and entitlement to commitment, whereas in the truth maker setting, we're using alethic modal notions of possibility and impossibility and of truth and falsity, truth makers and falsity makers. Yeah, Tom.
So here we have two examples of primary parents and the semantic distinction between truth and falsity. And I'm curious to say this isomorphism to me need to assume something like our impartial primary and parent is sound and complete or real semantic parent.
Right. We'll only actually get an isomorphism if something like that is true. All this is showing is that it's intelligible that we should be getting things right that way. We can make sense of if the worldly propositions, the way Fine is thinking of it, a proposition just is a pair of sets of states. The first set is all the exact truth makers of the claim, and the second state is all the exact false makers of it. We have a minimal structural requirement on those pairs to be a proposition, that it must be that any fusion of all the truth makers with any of the false makers is impossible. He calls that exclusion. But any two pairs of sets of states that meet those conditions, he says, is a worldly proposition. Nothing to do with us. They're out there in the world for us to grasp or think about. And what we're saying is we can actually understand what it is to grasp or think about those if our pragmatic attitudes and the way we changed our attitudes satisfied this global condition. Then there would be an exact isomorphism between the reason relations that articulate our sentences as we use them and the actual implications and incompatibilities of the worldly propositions, which we would in that sense be expressing. Now, presumably we're a long way from actually having that isomorphism. On the other hand, if we weren't sort of approximately getting it right, we wouldn't be thinking anything true. Okay, so the way that global isomorphism makes intelligible a correspondence between the pragmatics, what we're doing in our norm-governed social practices of asserting and denying, giving reasons for and against, is intelligible as grasp of the truth makers and false makers of propositions in this case. If you think about it at the level of reason relations among sentences and propositions, that's where this correspondence takes place, rather than looking for a correspondence between true claims and something. It's not that you don't get something like that, but it's downstream. That's not where you start. Okay, so that's a general up-to-the-minute perspective on these semantic and pragmatic aspects of what I'm calling the fundamental discursive bipolarity. Here's a second line of thought that doesn't involve the fancy truth maker semantics or the bilateral normative pragmatics, but is both more basic and subtler somehow. What are the relations between the truth values? Still thinking of the bipolarity, just true and false. Well, one very basic fact about them is there's two of them. It's a bipolarity. They're different, otherwise there wouldn't be two of them. And they're not just different, they're exclusively different. That is, they're different in the way in which square and circular are different, not in the way square and red are different. Square and red, those are different properties, all right, but something can have both of them. They're not exclusively different, they're merely different. I'm using those words, those are translations of Hegel's terms for these different kinds of difference. But it's already in Aristotle we've got contraries so they're exclusively different. Well, how are we to understand that? Well, they're incompatible. We can understand that fundamental feature of them. There's two of them. They're different, and they're not merely different, they're exclusively different. They're incompatible properties of sentences or propositions. That is, we're seeing the reflection of that reason relation of incompatibility at the level of sentences in the fact that no sentence can be both true and false. I mean, we're going to relax that as we look at fancier variations of truth values, but that's the fundamental reflection from the higher level of reason relations among sentences into the properties of truth and falsity expressed by those truth values. Second thing, though, they're not of the same value. You can't just swap falsity for truth everywhere and say, oh, it's just symmetric. On the side of belief, of doxastic attitudes, there's an asymmetry between acceptance and rejection, between assertion and denial. On the semantic side, there's a difference between truth and falsity. Truth is the good one. It's the one we want. But what do we mean by that? What is the nature of the priority that means that truth is primus inter pares, is first among the equals? And we have the truth values, but there's a certain priority that truth gets on the semantic side that acceptance and assertion get relative to rejection and denial on the pragmatic side, even though there also is a certain symmetry to them, a symmetry that you'll see in truth tables for it. What's the nature of that privileging of truth? I mean, it's metaphorical. I say that's the good one, that's the one we want. Is there anything more specific we can say about that? Well, yes. Truth is the one that's preserved by good implications. Good implications are the ones that, if they have true premises, have true conclusions. I mean, we could work up a version of that in terms of falsity, but it's the truth preservation of good implications. Truth is the property that distinguishes the good implications from the bad ones by being what's preserved by good implications. And that's the insertion or the reflection at the level of sentences of implication or consequence among the reason relations, the sense in which truth is privileged over falsity, the sense in which you can't just swap them and go on about, systematically, uniformly, and go on about your business, is you don't get a usable notion of implication if you look at falsehood preserving implications. As I say, if we've got a rich enough meta-language, we could use falsity to codify truth preservation. We could just put that in terms of falsity. But what is privileging the notion of truth is that it's what matters for good inference. So that's a second data point in the claim that you won't properly understand this basic discursive bipolarity, the bipolarity of truth and falsity on the semantic side and of acceptance and rejection or assertion and denial on the pragmatic side. You won't understand that properly if you stay at the level of sentences. in order to understand the significance of that bipolarity at the level of sentences, you've got to think about these rational relations among sentences. The functional role that sentences play in implications and incompatibilities is being reflected in the basic bipolarity at the level of sentences. Now, I take it these are somewhat unfamiliar lines of thought. Certainly the conclusion that the really conceptually fundamental discursive bipolarity is the distinction between reason relations of implication or consequence and reason relations of incompatibility, and that talk about truth and falsity and acceptance and rejection really has to be understood in terms of those. That is not something that's widely believed or even worried about. But all the considerations that are involved in it are present already, and present already in Frege, I want to claim. And that's sort of where I want to go next, is to think at this level of conceptual fundamentality about his notion of truth values. What features do they have to do the semantic work that he's using them to do? And we should keep our eyes peeled for relations of implication and incompatibility to show up as characters in the play here, even in Frege. Okay, so I was claiming the two basic considerations for at least taking the reason relations seriously, maybe for taking them to be more fundamental expressions of the basic bipolarity, is the global isomorphism and this way of understanding the two basic structural features of the truth values, their exclusiveness in terms of incompatibility, and the sense in which truth is privileged relative to falsity. They're not simply symmetrically incompatible. There's an asymmetry too, and that I was suggesting is the reflection of the role they play in codifying implications. Okay. So, second move here is to look to a distinction that Dummett makes. And there's two quotes here that matter. One of them on the handout, and the other I didn't have the wit to put on the handout. So here's Dummett from 1973, Frege's Philosophy of Language. Still, in my view, the best Frege book. If you're only going to read one, read that. In speaking of sentences themselves, so we're staying at the level of sentences, there are two different ways in which we may regard them, and these may give rise to two distinct notions of content. On the one hand, we may think of sentences as complete utterances, by means of which, when a specific kind of force is attached, a linguistic act may be effected. In this connection, we require that the notion of content, in terms of which the particular kind of force may be explained. We require that notion of content, in terms of which the particular kind of force may be explained. On the other hand, sentences may also occur as constituent parts of other sentences, and in this connection may have a semantic role in helping to determine the content of the whole sentence. So here we should be concerned with whatever notion of content is required to explain how the content of a complex sentence is determined from that of its components. There's no a priori reason why the two notions of content should coincide. Now, he goes on to label these two dimensions freestanding content and ingredient content. I mean, I think the paradigm of the freestanding content is paradigmatic force, paradigmatic speech act for declarative sentences is assertion. We need the kind of content associated with the sentence that will be adequate to understand assertional force. That's a notion of truth, because assertion is taking true. We're going to need something like assigning a truth value to it in order to get the role of the sentence as a freestanding expression. But sentences occur as parts of other sentences, as arguments to which we apply a sentence-forming operator, a function to them, and make a contribution to, play a role in determining the content in the freestanding sense of sentences that they're involved in. And there is no a priori reason why those notions should coincide. Now, I want to tarry a little bit with this observation of Dummett's. I think he's put his finger on a really fundamental bifurcation in semantic roles, notions of semantic content. Saying, really the notion of content, you'll see content is my word. Dummett says sense. He's talking about Zen. But I think there's a reason to not go with him on that. It's not that it's wrong for sense, but I think, just to put my cards on the table, that something just like that is true at the level of Bedeutung too. So it's misleading to restrict this to the notion of sense. But that's a point I want to come to at the end. We want a notion of content as part of our theory of force. That's the freestanding notion of content. Here he's thinking, well, why do we do semantics at all? Well, it's because we care about what we're doing when we talk, the moves we're making, the norms that govern them. And the idea is that you can use a sentence in lots of ways to perform lots of speech acts. The sentence can be used to make a claim, the door is shut, to formulate a request, please shut the door, or a command, shut the door, a question, is the door shut? And the idea is there's some core content that's common to those different kinds of force that we can attach to it, to those different speech acts that we can perform with it. And so if we want to understand what we're doing when we're talking or thinking, one theoretical strategy we might have is to postulate these theoretical entities, unobservables, contents, and say, well, if you associate these contents with the observable sentences and sentence utterances that you've got, you can get a systematic theory of what the norms are that determine whether you're speaking correctly or not. Whether we'll say what you say is true. Let me say parenthetically, Dummett thinks that's the way the later Wittgenstein thought about semantic contents, that they were theoretical concepts introduced to make sense of observable discursive behavior, and that Wittgenstein was a theoretical nihilist about them. He thought language is a motley. There is no common content that it's worth postulating, that it's helpful to postulate. And he thought that for deep reasons about how he thought about language. The only sentence that occurs verbatim in the Tractatus and in the Investigations is philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. And what he meant early and late was philosophers don't postulate theoretical entities. That's what scientists do. We redescribe the phenomena of our lived lives, and language is more protean. Any theory that you had of it, any set of contents that you attributed that made sense of your practice now, as soon as our practice changes, you need some other set. This is how Dummett sees Wittgenstein, as a theoretical semantic nihilist, precisely because he doesn't think that any useful specification of our discursive practices is going to go via the postulation of unobservables. But the entire semantic tradition from Kant on has begged to differ, or at least has aspired to giving an account of what we're doing in terms of the contents of expressed by those sentences, the contents of our thoughts. So there's a project anyway, and a sort of conception of semantics. Where does that start? Well, I would make a case that it starts really with Kant, but I'm not going to make that case here. It's clear in Frege, right at the beginning of the Begriffsschrift, we start with assertion and the assertion stroke. Affirmation and denial is the terms that he uses there. But what Frege really invented was the first one. Well, Bolzano's a special case, but sort of irrelevant to the tradition. What's really innovative in Frege is the concern with ingredient content, with saying semantics has got to let us formalize in a perspicuous manner the contribution that sentences make to the contents of sentences in which they appear as components. And in particular, the role that they play as the antecedents of conditionals. It matters that they also play the role of the negated item in a negation, but things are really much clearer with a conditional. And he aspired to have a compositional account of the contribution that sentences make to the content of sentences in which they're a part. And now ultimately that content of those sentences can be the freestanding content of them. Frege, with his notion of functional decomposition, in effect defines ingredient content by using his general method of noting invariance under substitution. Two sentences now are going to have the same ingredient content, just in case substituting one systematically for the other never changes the freestanding content of any sentence in which they occur as components. Now, that is an enterprise to give an account of ingredient content that no logician before Frege, Bolzano sort of had this idea, but he didn't actually do anything like this. It's really Frege's idea that we're going to systematically generate ingredient contents. Now, Dummett here says there's no a priori reason why these two notions should coincide. Why the notion that we use to understand the use of the expression in pragmatics, but now the semantic notion we use to understand that, should be the very same notion that we use to understand intersubstitutability, saving that other. Now here's an example of how they could come apart. So suppose I say, my example always was, I will write a book about Hegel. So I'm going to use that example even though I have now written my book about Hegel, and so this is no longer autobiographical. But imagine Bob 20 years ago. I will write a book about Hegel. You have to keep repeating that to yourself if you're going to take decades to do this. Consider another sentence. I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel, or I predict that I will write a book about Hegel. We can at least regiment the use of foresee or of predict so that I'm entitled to say those under just the same circumstance. The one we want to say is an expression of intention, the other is a prediction, but I could have all the same evidence for them. Their assertability conditions, their contribution to the force of my assertion when I'm entitled to it could be the same for those. But now think about their role, their ingredient content, their role as antecedent of conditionals. If I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel. That stuttering inference is, as safe an implication as you'll find, codified in the conditional. Yeah, you can always assert that. If I foresee that I'll write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel. No, I could get lazy, I could get hit by a bus. There's all sorts of slips between the cup and the lip possible. Though they have the same assertability conditions, we want to say they don't have the same truth conditions. It can be true that I foresee that I'll write a book about Hegel, and not true that I will write a book about Hegel if we're in one of the worlds where things don't go well. Well, that's to say that the truth conditions cut finer than the assertability conditions. If you want to get the ingredient content right, you have to look to the truth conditions, not just to the assertability conditions. My first published article, Truth and Assertability, in the Journal of Philosophy, is using this example out of Dummett to argue about what truth values are, about truth and assertability. But Dummett already had this idea, and let me say, cutting to the chase in this, what's important is that the consequences of application, what's implied by I will write a book about Hegel, is different from what's implied by I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel. That's what the conditional is picking up. They could have the same circumstances of appropriate application, but they certainly have different consequences of application. So we could understand that difference, the difference that makes the difference between assertability and truth, semantically, we could understand that in terms of consequence relations. Well, to really understand the relation between freestanding content and ingredient content, we can look to, of all places, multivalued logic, matrix semantics for multivalued logic. Something, I'm sure you learned in your baby logic course, the generalization of truth functions and truth tables to allow more than one truth value, something besides truth and falsity. But unless you were exceptionally fortunate, nobody talked when you were learning this about the deep conceptual issues that are raised by multivalued logic. And in particular, the clues that we get about the relation between freestanding and ingredient content from looking at three-valued logics, at least to begin with. And these are logics where we're going to give up some of those basic features of the truth values, either not treat them as exclusive or not restrict the good one to truth. We're going to be fiddling with those notions. So, in the way it's normally presented, if you look at the bottom of page 2, here's a typical three-valued matrix for a new connective, the shriek, the exclamation point. It says there's 3 values now, not just 2. Call them 1, 2, and 3. And if you look at the row and column entry that goes with any 2 of them, what you get is the value of sentence A, shriek, sentence B. A is on the rows, B is on the columns. So for instance, if the value of A is 2 and the value of B is 3, then the value of A shriek B is 3. That's how these things work. Now, it's important, though this is often suppressed in thinking about it, that there's an exclusion condition. Each sentence only gets one of these multi-values, we'll call them, truth values in a generalized sense. So you can't have more than one. There's exclusion, they're incompatible. But there's also got to be an asymmetry. There's got to be a good one. There's got to be an asymmetry between them as well. We put the star on one of them, say that's the designated multi-value. By that we mean that's the one that matters for freestanding content. That's the one that matters for the use of these expressions. How does it matter? Well, a good implication is one that if its components, if its premises get designated multi-values, then its conclusion does. And we can say that an expression is valid if no matter what multi-values its components get, it gets a designated value. So we're using the notion of the distinction between among multi-values, between some of them that are designated and others that are not. We're using that to understand the goodness of implication and the validity of sentences. And I want to say that that means that in multi-valued logic, there's 2 kinds of truth value, 2 kinds of semantic value. There's the multi-values, which are ingredient contents, and there's what I'll call the designatedness value. Is it designated or not? The multi-value of the sentence. And it turns out that multi-valued logic, as sort of mechanical and boring as grinding through these tables is a sophisticated conceptual apparatus for thinking about the relation between ingredient content and freestanding content. If we think about how multi-values and designatedness values, of which there's always just 2, either designated or not, what the interaction between those roles that semantic contents or values can be called on to play. I said that to use Dummett's language, Frege introduces ingredient contents by abstraction. Two sentences express the same ingredient content in case substituting one for the other never changes the freestanding content of any of the compound sentences in which they appear. And that's how we get, or anyway, that's a way we can think about multi-valued logics. Normally, we use the conceptual apparatus synthetically. That is, we write down this matrix that tells us, for two-valued connective, tells us what the value of any compound that has two old sentences. Now we get a new one, A shriek B, and it tells us the value of that. And because we know which of those values are designated and which are not, we can tell which sentences are valid and, more important, which implications are good. Validity of sentences is a sort of degenerate case. I'll say something about that in a minute. That's a synthetic use. Stipulate the multi-values, stipulate which of them are designated, and now you can derive what the good implications are, what the valid sentences are. That's not the way Frege is thinking about things. He's thinking analytically. We're starting with a bunch of compound sentences. We're starting with a force notion that attaches to some and not to others, and we're deriving the multi-values by assimilating sentences, saying two sentences have the same multi-value, just in case, well, they have to have the same designatedness value. It's really the multi-values that have the designatedness value. Why? Well, because you can think of a sentence as a degenerate compound of itself, and two sentences should be assigned to the same multi-value just in case substituting one for another in compound sentences never turns a designated sentence into an undesignated one. That will be sufficient for never turning a good implication into a bad one or a valid sentence into one that isn't. But the idea is the multi-values we can think of just as equivalence classes of sentences. All the sentences have the same multi-value, just in case substituting one for the other never changes the designatedness value of any of the compounds in which it appears. It can change the multi-values of it. Indeed, if it doesn't sometimes, then there's no reason to distinguish those multi-values. So substituting a sentence that has one multi-value for another can change the multi-value of the sentences they appear in. That's what the matrix gives us, but it never changes the designatedness value. This is an analytic way of using the apparatus. Start with your highest level force notion, the one you use in the pragmatics to say what we care about, what's assertable or what implications are good. Take that and now hold that fixed and assimilate expressions, sentences. Accordingly, as intersubstitution doesn't change that high-level value for compounds that it occurs in. So you can imagine looking at natural language and looking at where sentences occur in sentences, and when those sentences are assertable and when implications involving them are good, and assign some high-level notion of designatedness to them. The paradigm is to take them to be true, or take them to be assertable, or it's good enough if you just sort out which relations of implication and incompatibility hold, because you can get a top-level freestanding notion from that too, and then just look at what the effect of substitution of various sentences is, and assimilate all the ones that never, intersubstitution of which never changes the assertability or the role in implication of the compound sentences in which they occur. And in fact, this analytic use, where you carve up the compound sentences into functions and arguments and introduce by abstraction these new roles, where we say all these sentences play the same ingredient role, just in case all the ones in the equivalence class, intersubstituting them doesn't change the designatedness of any compound in which they occur. There is an analytic use of this in multivalued logic. If you give me some axiomatized logic, so I only have a proof theory for it. I know, these axioms are good, and here's the rules, and so everything you can get from the axioms, that's good. I've got this logic. Yeah, but could you get a matrix value, multivalued semantics that would endorse just the inferences that are made by this axiomatic system? You can see it'd be nice to have a mechanical way of doing that, a way of computing a matrix that would validate just those implications. One reason it would be nice is that would be a consistency proof. That's in effect giving you a model of that logic, and that's producing a matrix for each of the connectives, and showing that it produced just this consequence relation that shows you haven't made a mistake. It's a consistent system. And there is a mechanical way to compute it. It's due to Lindenbaum. It's Lindenbaum algebra. It says, take as your multivalues equivalence classes of sentences where the equivalence class is logically interderivable, given your rules. So things that are, according to your logic, logically equivalent, they all go in one equivalence class. And now we need to know which of those are designated. We'll take the theorems of the logic as the designated values. Now, just write down that matrix that has those equivalence classes, those designated values, and the compounds that you get are equivalence classes themselves. You can just grind through. And one of the features of the Lindenbaum construction, the Lindenbaum algebra is, well, you might end up with as many multivalues as you have sentences. Probably you won't if it's not a degenerate logic. Some of them are equivalent to each other. You get those, but you still could end up with an infinite number of multivalues. Well, okay, if you use it analytically, you have to be prepared for that possibility, that there isn't any great simplification that you get by grouping these sentences into equivalence classes. You still get an infinite number of them. That would be an instance where Wittgenstein was right. There was no point in discriminating ingredient content and freestanding content in that. But for any reasonably well-behaved set of rules that you get, the Lindenbaum algebra will give you a matrix that validates it. Frege is interested in that analytic use of, in effect, this conceptual apparatus, not starting with stipulations and building up, but introducing ingredient contents by abstraction using the method of noting invariance under substitution. Invariance of what? Of freestanding content, of whatever you're marking with the designatedness of a multi-value as the feature of it that matters for the pragmatics. Paradigmatically, the goodness of implications, but also validity of sentences. Okay. So that's a first time through saying there's actually conceptually interesting stuff going on in matrix-valued semantics for multi-valued logic. And the key to it is Dummett's distinction between ingredient and freestanding content, which shows up as the distinction between multi-values and the designatedness or non-designatedness of multi-values, where the principle is that two sentences have the same ingredient content or multi-value, just in case substituting one for the other never changes the designatedness value of any of the compounds involving them. Now, I think things get really interesting if we look at actual multi-valued logics from this analytic point of view. But maybe now is a good time to take our break. It's a little bit earlier than I usually do, but maybe that's not a bad thing. So it's 2:17. Let's come back at 2:32. Well, are there comments or questions in that, apropos of that line of thought before I turn the crank one more time? Okay, so there's two things I want to do still before the end of the class. And the one is talk about the actual multi-valued logics and the work that's been done over the last few decades on them that I think shows up looking differently against the conceptual background I've been sketching. And then I want to come back to the conceptual issues and think about intentions and extensions. And extensions as one kind of semantic content and intentions as another, because on the one hand, there's a temptation, not an ungrounded temptation, but in some ways a dangerous one, to line up the intention-extension distinction with the Sinn-Bedeutung distinction, to think of the senses as intentions relative to the Bedeutungen that are the extensions. And as I say, there's something right about that, but it's not completely right, and someone is in danger of at least getting Frege wrong, but also I think not learning everything that we could learn about intentions and extensions from him. And on the other hand, we have a statement of Dummett's. I didn't have the wit to put on the handout. Dummett says, if the notion of reference, Bedeutung, were introduced in the first place simply as that of the semantic role of expressions of different kinds, without an appeal to the name-bearer relation as a prototype, the idea that the Bedeutung of Fido is Fido, the Bedeutung of the morning star is Venus, then we should have no inclination to distinguish intentional from extensional contexts or to treat the former separately. On the contrary, there would be a natural presumption in favor of a uniform semantic treatment of all contexts. So here he's saying it's specifically we need to understand the relation between intensions and extensions in order to understand the relation or the role that's being played in Frege's thought by this name-bearer model, as opposed to the purely substitutional model that I identified with Tugendhat as the one who really pushed that notion of Bedeutung. So Dummett is sort of lining up the name-bearer as opposed to the substitutional model with extensions and intentions, saying, well, you wouldn't have this notion of extension at all. You just do it substitutionally. That would all be intentional with an S, he thinks. So I think Dummett is actually wrong about this, and I want to say how, in terms of retelling the story about ingredient and freestanding content in terms of intentions and extensions. But first, it'll be helpful to have under our belt the stuff that's on the epitomized on the last page of the handout. I would say that in the by the 60s and 70s, nobody really cared about multi-valued logic anymore. It seemed like all the philosophical juice had been squeezed out of it. It certainly wasn't technically very interesting. And that really all changed with Kripke's use of three-valued logic in his treatment of truth. He said that the way to handle the semantic paradoxes is to go three-valued. And this kicked off a real renaissance in thinking about it. Almost immediately, we had Graham Priest picking up on earlier work by the South American logician Acosta and endorsing a different three-valued logic, LP, he called it, for the logic of paradox, and said, no, this is a much better way to handle the logical paradoxes. And we had there was a reason for both philosophers and the logicians to look harder at multi-valued logic. And so I just want to give you a breathless summary of some of that work against the background of the conceptual framework I've been setting. So at the top, we see the connective definitions for Kleene's strong three-valued connective definitions. There's another set of connective definitions that are weak Kleene, that treat the middle value differently than this. But that hasn't turned out to be nearly as interesting or productive as this one. And the first striking thing is that K3, the logic that Kripke endorsed, and LP have exactly the same connective definitions. They understand conjunction and disjunction, negation, and so the conditional that they both are going to build De Morgan-wise out of these connectives. All the connective definitions are exactly the same. The relation between multi-values and designated values, they compound all the same. The difference is in how you understand consequence, and downstream from that validity, but the consequence is more important. And remember, that's a matter, consequence is a matter not of the multi-values, but of the designatedness values, what's designated and what's not. K3 is what you get if you just treat truth as the only designated value. That's the way Kleene thought about it. And if you do that, so only T is designated because they disagree about this. That's why I didn't star any of the values in the connective definitions here. What mattered to Kripke is that A or not A does not always get a designated value in K3. Right? So A or not A, you can see the table for that. False goes to true, true goes to false, but the middle value goes to the middle value. So if A has the middle value, then so does not A. So A or not A, we can check, has the middle value. That's not designated, so excluded middle doesn't hold. It's not the case that A or not A, that sometimes fails. There's some sentences for which it fails. Reflected up, that's going to mean that we can make sense of some sentences not being true or false. That's the middle that's excluded by excluded middle. It's not by K3. And that's the bin in which you want to throw the liar sentence and the other semantic paradoxes. That was Kripke's idea. So K3 is a logic of truth value gaps. Viewed bilaterally, you're saying some of the sentences are neither true nor false, and that shows up in the failure of excluded middle. Priest comes along and says, well, those connective definitions, those are just fine. That they are sort of the obvious generalization of the classical truth functional bivalent definitions. If you look at the two sort of triangles of U's in disjunction and conjunction, yeah, that's a sensible way to generalize two-valued truth values. But Priest says, treat the middle value as also a designated value. And if you do that, A and not A can get the designated value. You can have a contradiction that doesn't blow up your reasoning. In classical logic, everything follows from a contradiction because it's guaranteed to be false. And the only bad implications are ones that have true premises and a false conclusion. So it implies everything, it explodes. But a logic of paradox, he says, look, the liar, the thing about it, it says of itself that it's true and that it's not true. Sort of on the face of it, this very sentence is not true. It both says that it's true and says that it's not true. Surely it's philosophically more natural to assign it to a middle value of being true and false. That's what it says about it. So on the K3 reading, the middle value is neither true nor false, or anyway, that's a sensible way to think about it. And that's why something can, why A or not A can fail for one of those things that is neither true nor false. And LP has the middle value interpreted really as both true and false. That's why philosophically, that's the motivation for taking it to be a designated value. Well, the things that have the middle value are true. They're just also false. But designated, we mean true, and we're interpreting this as true and false. And that's what a contradiction A and not A can be. I mean, most of them are going to end up being false, but the paradoxical ones can go in the bin that says both true and false. And that would be a problem. We wouldn't be able to reason with them. It wouldn't help us any if contradictions like that blew up inferentially, if they exploded by implying everything. That's a paradigm of not being able to reason with them. But we can actually reason with them in LP. Both of those still use a notion of understand the relation between consequence and designatedness by saying an implication is good if it does not have a designated set of premises and an undesignated conclusion. So good implications preserve the designatedness of values. If their premises get designated values, so do their conclusions. So they have generically the same notion of consequence, but a different way of partitioning the multi-values into designated and undesignated. Now, LP and K3 end up being duals in a pretty straightforward sense of that. You can already see that. It's the sense in which excluded middle and non-contradiction are duals of one another. And where K3 is a logic of truth-value gaps, LP is a logic of truth-value gluts, where things can be true and false. I'll mention, jump to the bottom of the page there. If you go to a four-dimensional logic, a four-valued logic with two values other than true and false, and treat one of them as meaning neither in the way LP does, and treat the other one as meaning both, meaning neither in the way that K3 does, and the other one is meaning both in the way that LP does. If you just throw in both of those, you do need to fiddle with the connective definitions to do that. You get first-degree entailment is the most basic relevance logic is what you get. And all sorts of interesting technical things happen in the four-valued logic. My Pitt colleague, Newell Belknap, his most famous, most cited single article called How Computers Should Think, argues for using a four-valued semantics for thinking about databases in general. So if you throw both of them in together, you get first-degree entailment, FDE, which accordingly, there's a sort of kite that has K3 over here and LP here and FDE at the top and just the two-valued classical logic at the bottom. Now, here's a thing, a claim Ulf and I make in our logic book, a formal result that matters to us and that I think is an important piece of the puzzle here as we think about the relation of sentential forms of the fundamental discursive bipolarity, truth and falsity, or the pragmatic versions of it, in relation to the reason relations of implication and incompatibility version, which I believe nobody had noticed before, certainly not in the generality that we're able to demonstrate it. If you look at the level of consequence relations at K3 and LP, K3 is the logic of premissory role inclusions, and LP is the logic of conclusory role inclusions. These are meta-inferential relations. If you're in a fully structural setting, and the structure that really matters here is if your consequence relation is guaranteed to be transitive, then if you've got an implication, Pedro's a donkey, so Pedro's a mammal. There's really three things, three relations that coincide here. One is going across the turnstile. You say, well, that's a good implication. But now, suppose we just looked at the premissory side of that. We can still talk about the relation of mammalness to donkey, in that if this holds, it's going to be the case that you'll never turn a good implication into a bad one by substituting DP for MP as a premise. Because being a donkey does imply being a mammal, it's stronger as a premise than the mammal claim is. It implies that. So anything that's implied by MP as a premise is also going to be implied already by donkey. So okay, so you will always be able to substitute DP for MP, donkey for mammal, as a premise, salva consequentia, without turning a good implication into a bad one. Because everything that's implied by Pedro being a mammal is already implied by him being a donkey. That, as a premise, little P down there, also implies MP. But now what about as a conclusion? Well, again, because being a donkey implies being a mammal, if we're looking downstream at the conclusions, if we're looking at the role these things can play when we're substituting for them as conclusions, any conclusion that follows from MP already follows from DP. And that means that we can always substitute DP for MP as a conclusion. We can always substitute MP for DP as a conclusion. Anything that implies that Pedro is a donkey will also imply that he's a mammal. So you'll never turn a good implication into a bad one by substituting MP for DP as a conclusion, because anything that implies he's a donkey also already implies that he's a mammal. Notice that the order of these things is flipped here. Well, what we show is that the logic of premissory role inclusions, which really only look at the role of these things as premises of implications, in the case where these three relations don't just coincide, if the implication relations you're codifying don't always satisfy transitivity, then these three things can come apart. And when they do come apart, K3 is the logic of these, of the premissory role inclusions, and LP is the logic of conclusory role inclusions. I say these are meta-inferential because we're looking at substitutions that preserve the goodness of implications, but we're looking exclusively at substitutions here. So we're comparing this with a bunch of other implications in both cases. As I say, normally, if this one holds, then so do these and vice versa. They all go together, but they can come apart. And when they do, K3 and LP come apart and are these logics of premises and their implications and conclusions and their implications. So our claim is, I'm not going to try and reproduce this argument, that in order to understand these logics, K3 and LP, you shouldn't stay at the level of sentences and look at truth value gaps and gluts. That's actually a relatively superficial feature of these logics. You should look at what role they play in codifying implications and see that K3 is the logic of premises and premissory roles. You can read that subscript with the P as the role of DP as a premise is contained in the role of contains. It should be. Yeah, it should be contains. So this is another data point in the overall claim that this basic discursive bipolarity you need to think about at the level of reason relations and not just at the level of sentences where things get reflected. I mean, these are the logics of truth gaps and truth gluts. That's true, but that's because they're the logic of premissory and conclusory role inclusions. And as I say, that argument deriving the gappy and glutty behavior from the premissory and conclusory roles, that's an argument too complicated to go into here, but you can find it in the book if you like. Before we leave this topic, I want to mention another pair of logics, which also said K3 and LP are duals to each other in a certain way, and they're also related. This is different from the relation that gives you FDE here, where you go four valued. This is still at three valued logics, an even more radical way of keeping the same connective definitions, the Strong-Kleene three valued connective definitions, and getting a different logic by changing the definition of consequence. Is the ST stands for strict tolerant. And it's the paradigmatic non-transitive logic. It gives up the idea that a good consequence preserves designatedness. It looks at the middle value and says, a consequence is good if it doesn't have true premises, that is strictly true, not the middle value, and strictly false consequences. Anything else is good. So for instance, an implication from T to U is good because the conclusion is not strictly false. So the idea is that we look at the strict truth, just having value t of the premises, and instead of saying, that must be preserved or something must be preserved about that, we say, well, as long as the conclusion isn't too false, it isn't purely false, it's okay. And ST gives you exactly the theorems of classical logic. Its consequence relation is different. It's not transitive, for instance, because a conclusion that won't infirm an implication, if you move it over to the premissory side, not good enough. We need something strictly true over there. So you can't chain these implications. But so it has a non-transitive consequence relation, but all the theorems of classical logic. And the fabulous logic group in Buenos Aires has, over the last 20 years, exploited these logics. TS is the tolerant strict. It's just the dual logic of that. It has no theorems, and so is somewhat less useful, but is dual to ST. At any rate, in our understanding of the meta theory of proof theory, they've argued ST is the logic of the meta theory of proof theory. Okay, I'm not the only sort of philosophical conclusion I'm wanting to draw from this is that here again, if we look at the details, we see another data point where thinking about this fundamental, this basic discursive bipolarity at the level of reason relations, of implications, it tells you something that you just can't see if you look at the gaps and gluts at the sentential level. Okay. Well, now, I want to finish by saying something about intentions and extensions, sort of back to the philosophy from the, from at least pointing at these bits of logic. In the original Dummett quote, he says there's no a priori reason why the notion of freestanding content and ingredient content should coincide. But Frege takes it that it does. At least at the level of Bedeutungen, they do. That is, he's not going to sort sentences into equivalence classes that cut finer than the truth values do. Truth values are introduced by abstraction. Two sentences have the same truth value, compared two lines have the same direction, just in case either they're both true, in which case the truth value is the true, or they're both false, in which case it's the false. That's a very crude way of grouping sentences, but in his logic, that's all the multi-values that there are. In order to determine whether a conditional is true or a negation is true, a disjunction or a conjunction, you can use the freestanding contents of those expressions as the multi-values. You don't need to distinguish undesignated among undesignated multi-values. Well, that's because he was giving us two-valued logic, even though not writing down truth tables for it. He did that at the level of Bedeutungen, which is where truth values are. Now, the reason I redacted that original Dummett quote and put in the square brackets content where he said sense is because I think the pattern that that Dummett distinguishes of there being a top level force relevant notion, designatedness, the thing that's preserved by good implications or sets the norm for assertion if it's truth. Dummett thinks of that as only applying at the level of senses. But if we see Frege as treating designatedness values as multi-values, then his treatment of Bedeutung has exactly the same form. Because we're looking at grouping sentences by intersubstitutability salva veritate in compounds. And that he can do with just truth values. But Dummett sees it applying at the level of sense, and I think there it does, and it's important. In the second quote, he says, if the notion of Bedeutung were introduced in the first place simply as the semantic role of expressions, without appeal to the name-bearer relation, then at the outset we'd have no inclination to distinguish intentional from extensional contexts. Well, I think this is not right. A thing to mean by extensional just is that you don't have to make a difference, you don't have to make a distinction between freestanding and ingredient contents. If you don't, if your top-level notion cuts fine enough to determine the contribution that those sentences make to the truth value of the sentences in which they're components, that's a sense of extensional, in which his treatment of the Bedeutungen is extensional, quite apart from the name-bearer relation. It's also true that his treatment of sense is not extensional in that sense. At the level of sense, we don't take it that we can, that it's sufficient that two expressions are intersubstitutable salva veritate for them to be intersubstitutable salva consequentiae. At the level of sense, when we're looking at all the different functional decompositions and analyses of sentences, we can have sentences that have different senses, have the same Bedeutung, and so are intersubstitutable salva veritate, but have different inferential involvements. That's what we're keeping track of with the senses via the inferential patterns that are individuated by the modes of presentation that we get by substitutionally decomposing sentences into functions applied to arguments. But there is another sense of extensional. So I say, so Bedeutungen are extensional in the sense that their freestanding contents don't cut any finer than their ingredient contents. The ingredient contents don't cut any finer than the freestanding contents. We can just use designatedness, and that gives us two-valued classical logic, which he at least has as a proper subset, if we're not worried about functions that take functions as arguments. And senses are not, for Frege, extensional in that sense. That is, the freestanding content notion is the goodness of implications, and we don't presuppose that you can intersubstitute any two sentences, that any two sentences you can intersubstitute we allow that the ingredient contents can cut finer than the freestanding contents on the side of saving the goodness of implications, which is what matters for senses. So that's intentional with an S, again, in the sense that doesn't depend on the name bearer model, because everything we're talking about is at the level of senses. So I'm thinking of the level of senses as having three levels, where the level of Bedeutungen only has two. Bedeutungen, we've got freestanding contents and we've got ingredient contents, but it turns out we can just use the freestanding ones for the ingredient ones. That's where we're assimilating sentences accordingly as substituting one for the other doesn't change the truth value of any sentences in which they're components. On the level of senses, our top level notion, I'm claiming, is the goodness of implications. We're going to look at intersubstitutions salva consequentiae and assign to sentences the same freestanding content, just in case substituting one for the other as premise or conclusion of an implication never turns an implication that's a good one into a bad one. And now we can ask, for that notion of freestanding content, is there another notion of ingredient content? That is, if one of these sentences is, say, a conditional, and it's got its equivalence class of things that you can substitute for it as premise or conclusion, salva consequentiae, now does it follow that any of the two sentences that are in the same sense equivalence class here are also interchangeable as antecedents of the conditional at this third level? If it's the case that these two sentences, just when they're serving as premises or conclusions of sentences, can be intersubstituted, saving the goodness of the implication, then are they intersubstitutable as the antecedents and consequence of conditionals? And the answer is, well, yes, it ought to be. We introduce the conditionals to let us say what implications are good. And so it ought to be the case that if substituting Q for P could change the role of the conditional, the role as a premise or conclusion of the conditional that they're an antecedent of, then there ought to be some implication that if that sentence, instead of being part of another sentence, is just the premise itself, that substituting Q for it would turn that into a bad implication. So in that sense, Frege's treatment of senses is also extensional, in that all that's happened is we've changed the top level notion of freestanding content so that the invariance under substitution that we're using to assimilate things that have the same content is salva consequentiae instead of salva veritate, but all of his logical vocabulary is also going to have their senses be, in this sense, a function of their freestanding roles. Well, so is there nothing, these are both extensional, where is there anything intentional in all of this? Well, in the relation between the assertional substitutional hierarchy, the sentential substitutional hierarchy that has two levels, and the inferential assertional hierarchy that has three: inferences, premises and conclusions, and then parts, sentences that are parts of the premises and conclusions. Before we just had the sentences and their sentential parts. In each of those domains, with their different top-level notions, the one we look at substitution salva veritate, the other salva consequentiae, but in each case we don't need to cut the ingredient contents finer than we do the freestanding contents. But there is still a residual notion of extensionality available, and that would be if the assertional substitutional hierarchy determined the consequential substitutional hierarchy. If the roles, the equivalence classes that are multi-values on the Bedeutung side, where two sentences have the same multi-value if they're intersubstitutable as components of other sentences, salva veritate, if those equivalence classes could serve as the freestanding and ingredient contents in the inferential hierarchy, in the consequential hierarchy. And that's a question about the relation between Sinn and Bedeutung. And my claim would be, it's not the case that Frege is thinking of the assertional hierarchy as determining the consequential hierarchy. Those are different things you can treat as the top-level notion. And that's an important component of the relation between senses and references. But the notion of intension and extension that's in play there doesn't depend on your appeal to a name-bearer relation. That only has to do with subsentential expressions, singular terms. That's saying the Fido relation is key to understanding Bedeutungen. I mean, that is really important. That's how Bedeutungen can both be introduced by abstraction and also be, perceptible objects. That's conceptually a very important move. But everything I've been talking about today has been at the level of sentences. And the name-bearer model doesn't come up there, except in the form of truth values being the Bedeutungen of sentences, where thoughts are the senses of those sentences. So there are notions of intension and extension that apply already just at the sentential level. Okay, so I pitched this class at the beginning saying I wanted to look really hard at the notion of truth value and unpack it to say sort of what dimensions there are to it, what jobs of work do we call on the notion of truth value to do, pointed out that they have these features, well, the exclusiveness of them in the basic discursive bipolarity. Exclusiveness, well, that now becomes exclusiveness of the multi-values, not of the highest level values where we can get true and false, or not true and not false, but on pain of revenge paradoxes, we can't have something that's both neither true nor false and also true. That's sort of moving up a different hierarchy. There's the notion of truth value as what's preserved by good inference or good implication. That remains in play, but what we've seen over the 100 years since Frege's death is that that's a much more complicated story than he thought it was. There's many different ways of determining the goodness of implications from features of sentences than just saying, oh, good implications never take you from true premises to false conclusions. So both the exclusiveness it turned out, well, there's a bunch of different questions there about the exclusiveness of the truth values, but also about the preferential privileging of one or of some of the truth values. And those complications have ramifications for the two roles that Dummett emphasizes and teaches us about. The freestanding force-relevant notion, the one that motivates doing semantic theory at all, is because we can explain something about the proper use of these expressions in terms of the semantic values that we assign to them. But both that notion of freestanding content and the notion of ingredient content, the story is more complicated when we look at all the options that we have for playing a role like that. I find it remarkable that although these conceptual considerations are not usually part of the package that people learn when they learn to do multi-valued logic, in fact, you can see this formal apparatus, this formal language of matrix-valued semantics as a very powerful and perspicuous meta-vocabulary for talking about freestanding roles, ingredient roles, noting invariance under substitution salvo veritate, noting invariance under substitution salvo consequentiae. So in my view, Frege just would have had his mind blown by looking at these logical developments, at least described in something like the terms that I've described them today. So this is more under the rubric of Frege in context. His notion of truth value, it's his, he introduced it, and he worried about ingredient contents for the first time by noting invariance of some higher level thing under substitution and abstracting contents from that. And it turns out that opens up into a much richer conceptual environment than he could have imagined even. But luckily, we can imagine it. Okay, well, so for next time, we're looking at these famous late essays, the thought, negation. Some of these same considerations will come up, but wanted you to have this background for reading them.